pretty sure, and a lot of philosophers would agree, is all those sets of experiences, the things which fill our consciousness. And the reason why that becomes disturbing, if you think about it too much, to some people at least, is that it kind of takes the floor away. It means that there's nothing permanent or settled which grounds us. We just become this story, and the story is constantly in flux.
Give us the nuts and bolts on this. What did Locke and Hume think about this question?
Well, I mean, Locke is often described as having a memory criterion for personal identity, meaning that you are the same person just as long as you have a chain of memories between yourself and your past self. Now, that's actually not quite true, and I think on Hume's version of this argument that becomes clearer, but in a sense it was already there in Locke. The best way of perhaps putting Hume's view is he only once used this term, a bundle, but it's a wonderfully evocative word. The idea is that you are not, as it were, something which has experiences, memories, perceptions, desires. Rather, there are all these different memories, perceptions, desires, etc., and they all kind of are related to each other, and you are that relation and nothing more. There's no soul underneath it holding it together, and to the extent that the body or brain hold it together, that's just because we're kind of biological accident, if you like. We need that, but that's not what makes you you.
So are we right then to think of memory as being the vehicle that gives us this kind of continuity? Stephen Rose.
Yes, memories do above all constitute us uniquely, I think, amongst the living species on Earth.
So we've had doubt cast upon the idea that we have some spiritual or physical essence that makes us who we are. What about this idea of memory? Is it memory that gives us our sense of continuity through time? I want to introduce you now to Lisa Russell. Lisa, what happened to you?
In 2005, the 27th of January, I had a severe car crash which caused severe brain injury. When I woke up, I thought I was 14. I was really 19. I had forgotten the first 20 years' life of memory.
So you have no memory at all of anything that happened to you before the age of 20?
I have got no memory at all. Can't remember school, couldn't remember my mum, thought my mum was my next door neighbour, didn't recognise any of my friends, thought my boyfriend was just a friend, so I broke his heart and I told him I didn't love him and there was an engagement ring on my finger.
So were there then two Lisa Russells?
Oh yeah, as one of my ex-boyfriends referred to me, Lisa 1 before the crash and Lisa 2. So whenever I speak to people and they ask about Lisa 1, I got to refer to myself as Lisa 1 so I remember who I'm talking about.
So she seems a very separate person to you.
Lisa 1 is totally different. I can't remember Lisa 1.
So you've just got to take other people's word for that.
Yeah, it's just what people have told me Lisa 1 was. And apparently Lisa 1 was a very snobby, arrogant woman who didn't respect other people, and Lisa 1 only ever thought of herself.
And what's your attitude to that?
Well...
Who is she to you, this person who you were
Lisa
before?
1 was the past. Lisa 2 is now the living person, because through my accident, I died twice. So Lisa 1 is dead and buried. Lisa 2 is now living.
We also have in the room Katrina Morrison, who's an expert on the movement and the structure of memory. Is, as far as you're concerned, identity a construct of memory? Is memory what makes us who we are? That's what Lisa's evidence would seem to suggest.
Absolutely. As psychologists, we believe that memory is absolutely the essence of who we are. We believe that unless you know where you've come from, you cannot place yourself in the present, and then you cannot plan things going forward. So when we talk about memory, we're not talking about a unitary construct. There are two essential elements to memory, which is what we psychologists call the semantic bit, which is what you kind of know about yourself. I am a mother, I am a psychologist, I am bad at football, or whatever it might be. And then you have what we call the episodic elements, which is the stories that you can hang on that. If we were to say to somebody like Lisa, well, tell me what it's like to be a mother, if you've got the amnesic condition, then what you're going to find it really difficult to do is to actually hang a story on that. It's about having a kind of narrative account. It's not simply about knowing facts about yourself, it's about knowing this sort of story of your life.
But how reliable is memory? It seems a rather fragile basis for something as important as our sense of who we are. We all know that our memories play tricks on us.
Our memories do. And actually, there's an extent to which that's an adaptive feature. You know, it serves us well in life, because if we have bad experiences, maybe we want to play them down, and maybe we want our current narrative of what our lives are like and have been like and will be like actually to be slightly more positive than is really true.
Lisa, do you feel responsible for any of the actions of the person who you were before the accident? Say that you discovered evidence that you had committed fraud, let's say, in your former life. Would you feel a sense of responsibility for that? Would you give yourself in?
I think I would, because even though I'm two Lisas, I'm still Lisa. Because even though it was the old me, it was still me who caused this problem.
Julian, would the philosopher, if you were advising Lisa on what to do in these circumstances, would you say keep quiet or turn yourself in?
Well, I don't think she would be responsible, but I think her answer is really interesting, because in that point she was saying that in some sense she feels she is the same person, even though earlier it sounded like she very much distinguished between Lisa 1 and Lisa 2. And I think that actually pinpoints a really important thing here, which is that we kind of want the answer. Am I the same person or not? Whereas if you ask these questions of Theseus's ship, of this pub, of the drifters, the answer actually is always in some ways yes, and in some ways no. And what you need to know is what is the way that matters for this particular thing. So in some ways, yes, it's been Lisa the same person all the way through. From the point of view of criminal responsibility, I would say that's not the relevant one. Don't worry, you should be let off anything you did previously. But from other points of view, perhaps, you know, from a point of view of studying genetic illness, for example, yes, it's very important. You are the same person because you're the same biological organism.
Stephen Rose.
I wouldn't go with that. I actually think that responsibility, because it's an act which actually impinges not just on you as an individual, but on the whole of society around it. Think, for example, of someone who's a war criminal. Should they, because they have had an accident, or simply because they're 30 or 40 or 50 years older, simply be absolved of responsibility, even though every molecule in their body has changed over, even though they may be war criminal 1 at one point and then sort of good person 2 at another point? I don't think you can have that. I just want to say one thing about memory as well, which is very important in this context. I wonder if Katrina would agree with this, and that is that we talk about memory as if we remember something that happened when we were 4, or in Lisa's case, what happened 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. But because memory is essentially dynamic, each time we remember something, we reconstitute it itself in molecular and biological terms as well as in narrative terms. So when you're remembering something now, you're remembering the last time you're remembering it. You're not remembering when it happened previously. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And that's why it is a narrative. It is constructed. It is not a videotape account of your life. But that is not necessarily a bad thing.
Who else has a view on this idea of criminal responsibility? If you have committed a crime that you've forgotten, are you responsible for it? Yes.
Well, certainly you are, because it's not just your memory that's impinged here. Other people have remembered that crime as well. So if it's an act, a crime, then it's not what you remember only. That's got to be set against what the rest of the world remembers.
Julian Baggini, what's your position on this? Should we be chasing up old crimes? Because from the philosophical point of view, it seems as though there are a lot of things you can bring to that to make that a rather problematic process.
Well, indeed, but it goes back to this point, I think, which is that we want sort of yes or no, either or answers. Now, in fact, in experience, what we tend to find is that we actually, by nature, if you like, without thinking about it too philosophically, adopt, which I think is the right philosophical attitude, which is that we take each case in its merits and we can recognise that these things are mitigated. So, for example, when someone did commit a crime a very long time ago and they're very clearly completely reformed, for example, we at least punish them less. So what matters is what is the nature of the discontinuity between you at the time of the crime and you now, and then how do you treat that? But I mean, where I think Stephen's right to worry is that we should probably err on the side of responsibility, because it's a social thing. You know, the thing about holding people responsible for their crimes is we tend to think it's about your guilt. But actually, a lot of the reason why we have to do this, why we have to have a criminal justice system, is because we have to exercise a certain amount of what we call social control. We need to make sure that everyone is aware that if they do something, they're going to be chased up for it, even if perhaps they forget about it, and even if they do change a bit.
So where does this leave us? Much of the philosophy that we've heard tonight has painted this picture of selfhood as something unstable, something ephemeral, something illusory even. Is this a truth that it's impossible to live by, Julian?
I don't think it is impossible to live by. Some people find it difficult. The self isn't illusory. We really do exist. But we have to accept the fact that we are more fluid things than we like to think. That as we've heard, our memories are not just records of the facts, they are constructions. We're constantly in a process of constructing ourselves. But we can't just construct any old narrative from this, right? We can't just make up anything we like. So can we live by it? To a certain extent, yes. But on the other hand, I think we're always drawn towards sort of like myths of there being more stability, more essence, more accuracy to our memories than we think. And so I think that the only way to live it authentically is to not sort of battle too hard against the idea of continuity. We need that, and there's some sense in it. There's an illusion only if you think that the self is this unchanging pearl or core or essence. As long as you don't think that, as long as you think that the self is something which is constructed out of a real biology and a real events and real history and real memories and experiences, then you can have a sense of self which is, sure, it's a more fluid and it has more sort of porous boundaries than the common sense view, but it's a real one. And I think ultimately it's a liberating way of living, because it's liberating because we no longer feel we're trapped within this sort of permanent kernel which is never going to be changed. We can't do anything about it. You know, if you're in the wrong body, for example, you can change your body perhaps if you're lucky enough to be able to have that kind of access.
OK, so during the time that we spent in this room together, we now know that we've been transformed in all kinds of the ways that we can't begin to understand. But I want to now see if this has changed anybody's views about the drifters. Let's put this to the vote. Are we in the presence of the drifters? Tap your glasses if you think no. And remember that this choice carries big implications for the coherence of your own personal identity too, and that these guys have come a long way to be here tonight. So tap your glasses if you think the drifters are not here. Negligible. If you think the drifters are here, and it would be bad manners to say otherwise, tap your glasses now.
Philosophers, please.
The landlady has spoken. Time for us to track down an identical replica of this pub that has a slightly later closing time. So let me thank our philosophical barflies, Julian Bagini, Kathy Butler, Katrina Morrison, Stephen Rose and Lisa Russell, and our musical special guests. Tune in next time for another round of slightly beery debate at the Philosopher's Arms. And now let's hear from a band whose very name evokes the slightly scary indeterminacy of selfhood. The Drifters!
There, upon some distant shore.